Om Mano Buddhahamkara Chitani Naham Natya Shrotra Jive Natya Grana Netre Natya Vayu Natya Tejo Navakpani Padam Chidananda Rupaha Shivaham Shivaham Natya Vyoma Natya Bhumir Natejo Navayu Chidananda Rupaha Shivoham Shivoham. I am not the mind, nor the intellect, nor the ego, nor am I the senses of tasting, touching, hearing, smelling, and seeing. I am not air, earth, fire, water, or ether. I am the bliss, the very form of consciousness. I am Shiva. I am Shiva. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Sahana Vavatu, Sahana Bhunaktu, Sahaviryam Karavo Vahoy, Tejasvi Navaditamastu, Ma Vidvi Shovahoy. Om Shantihi, Shantihi, Shantihi. May Brahman protect us, may Brahman sustain us, and may Brahman illumine our thinking consciousness. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, or with the teachings, and may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat. And you have our welcome here to SRV Loka and its live streaming site where we are just convening after 2 days after Shankara's birthday. Why I chanted the first sloka of the Nirvana Shatkam just now. Na Mano Buddhahamkara Chitani Naham. And on Mother's Day, on Sunday, so those 2 holy days are here upon us. And it's a good time to be talking about the avatar. Shankar himself was one of the great avatars of modern times in the Shaivite tradition. And we are talking mostly about the incarnation of Sri Ramachandra for the last month of Sundays, we've been calling it. 4 Sundays in a row we talked about his discourse of divine discontent in front of Dasaratha, a lot of D's there, and the court where all of the people of the Koshala kingdom who lived there in the city gathered to hear great talks on the Dharma in that Treta Yuga. They were very interested in what was available to them to maintain their divine memory so that they wouldn't fall into the forgetfulness that, for instance, we have fallen into in the Kali Yuga, which is now. You are here, like the star map says. So in the Kali Yuga, we find ourselves with 4/4 of our knowledge of spirituality missing, has gone missing. And except for just a few souls that we go to who help remind us of this Paravid, of this Atma Gyan, even in its less intense form called Dharma. Except for those few beings, we find ourselves having to look back into ancient times to find these great teachers like Sri Ramachandra and after him Sri Krishna, both the same soul. The 10 avatars of Vishnu, they're called Dasa Avatara. There's a beautiful hymn about them which we could sing you and probably have before. And they fell over the 4 ages, these 10. So we go back just at the end of the second yuga, Treta Yuga, to find Sri Ramachandra bringing that yuga to a close and ushering in the Dwapara Yuga, which Krishna would bring to a close later, before the Kali Yuga began. And an interesting fact we have now is that Holy Mother, Sri Sharada Devi, has told us that the Kali Yuga ended when Sri Ramakrishna was born. So that's a new way of thinking of things that probably is not so traditional a way of thinking of it. But I think if you look at the four yugas and time in the illusory way in which he's talking about them right here, we probably won't get there today. But kala and kalas means kala, time, as a concept or as a principle, if you believe it to be real. And it's phases, it's passing phases, kalas, that people fall into, where probably the most recent great avatar, at least we would call him that, and the Vaishnavas do, he's one of the 10 Dasa avatars, was Lord Buddha. They included him in the avatars, and he talked about phases of time in terms of a kala chakra, which brought people back to earth and then to heaven. That is the lower heaven, I would say, of the ancestors, and brought them back to earth again many times over in a kind of hypnotic way. They had become enchanted with wealth. That's another thing we probably won't get to today. Kanchana. And with all that the Shakti provided. We won't get to that today either. What we will do today is find our way through mind and body. That's how we'll conclude this 4-class series. If we have a 5th class coming, that's a spare Sunday sometime after next week, because we're on a break next week, you'll be seeing the Amrita Nada Upanishad in Portland, Oregon, if you tune in with us next Sunday, which is very good. We might be trying to conclude that Saturday and Sunday, so you can live stream for that. But we won't be in Hawaii then, so we'll be at Satsang and God Blogs on Saturday morning with you as usual. But then you'll have to look and stream. We'll stream to you from Portland, Oregon, for this beautiful Amrita Nada, the nectar of this divine sound that you hear when you hear a great soul like this speak. That will be in terms of the mind-body connection that we're going to end with today, which will wrap it up. But we might have a 5th class sort of on its own that we could add to this series later, covering these 4 that I'm just starting out mentioning right now. And time and cycles is one of those things. So in that vein then, we look back to these ancient times. The cycles actually are not just illusory in a negative way, but they mark time so that we can see its passage and then hopefully not fall into the fact that it's really actually happening, because it flows by minutes, seconds, hours, months, years, centuries, millennia, ages, without people even really knowing it, what's going on. And they come and they go, as Krishna says in the Gita. And nobody sees that one. Ikramantan stitam vyapi bunjanam, he says in the Gita. They don't see the one that stays and remains the same as the many change in path. So they're rather hypnotized by time, and they feel somehow to be in it. But the phases passing like that causes them to focus on things that happen in time rather than the Almighty Spirit or Brahman or Buddha nature, how you want to call it, Allah, which is not in time, which is existing outside of time, or you could say time actually is going on inside of it, rather like poison in a snake, Sri Ramakrishna said. So all of these great souls have been talking about time in that way. It's illusory nature, but it does mark things for us so that we can, in our present lifetime, in this particular lifetime we're in, see these great souls and hear what they said, which have been recorded in the Shruti and in the non-dual scriptures. And that's what we've been doing for a month of Sundays. And we'll pick that up today And we'll end this series in an hour and a half with mind-body connection. That's what you see there, manas and deha. But I did tell you last week that we could make a real quick jump and take a big bite swiftly of these quick four here: infancy, youth, lust, and old age, because they're shown on this chart. So let's wipe those clean right now. That is, when you know them, you clarify them. When you clarify them, you can transcend them. That's what knowledge is meant for, is to help you transcend these things that are illusory and are causing people problem. And this is what's in the divine discourse that Ram is giving. He's talking about these 6 transformations, which Buddha talked about thousands of years later: birth, old age, birth, growth, old age, decay, and death. The 5 billows in Buddhism, the 6 transformations in Vedanta. However you look at them, the series have been looking at these for a long time. And there you see at the top of this chart the 6 transformations first. Jayati, birth, which is there on the chart. And asti, growth, is a transformation. Ironically, it doesn't really happen. So when you tell your children you're growing, you should tell them your body's growing or your mind is expanding. But your soul never grows because it's never born. So birth and growth right away fall under the scrutiny of these great souls who are saying neti neti to them. No, it's not really that. It's not that at all. You're never born, you never grow. Things in nature do that. Things in prakriti, things in time. And so they immediately set you right in a right orientation about these phenomena that are going on. That you should be the witness, sakshi bhutam, of all phenomena, not the participant in them. If you do participate in them, it should be only by way of association, not by way of identification. That's a bit of teaching from our birthday boy 2 days ago, Shankara. You should only associate with things in nature, never identify with them. We talked about that on yesterday morning, in terms of the Annapurna Upanishad, when we said the conclusion of that Upanishad towards the end was, you are an infinite being. Never allow yourself to be finitized. Never allow yourself to be finitized. It was a message my teacher, Swami Sheshanandaji Maharaj, peace and bliss be upon him always, would say almost every discourse he gave to us. And he had some divine discontent going on in his discourses, I can tell you, watching the Americans for 40 or 50 years hear this great philosophy of Vedanta and not step up to the plate so much and realize it. He kept asking us, where's your Jivan Mukta? Vivekananda came in 1893 and you still haven't produced a Jivan Mukta? You've had this Vedanta for that many decades, and up to the time when he came in 1893, and you still haven't produced a Jivan Mukta yet. So he had some of that divine discontent in his discourses. So he talked about that in terms of you being an infinite soul. You're an infinite being, and don't allow yourself to be finitized. That's what brings you suffering, is when you think you're a finite being. And these things we're talking about here, from the top to the bottom, are all finite. And you're the witness of them all. This is why he's bringing them out and allowing you to look at them in a detached way, not by identifying with them as you've been doing for lifetimes and suffering them as a result, but by withdrawing from them and only associating with them, as Sri Ramakrishna said, from a distance. From a distance, we're going to look at this odd changing creature called Maya, the chameleon in the tree that changes color, as Sri Ramakrishna says. That's a good God blog we could look at. So Jayate and Asti, you can see the quotes there by this beautiful young avatar. He says, beings rush to welcome the birth of a child, overlooking serious factors like delusion and suffering which play into embodiment in Maya. in his own case, born in the King Dasaratha, and the kingdom there with 2 queens, several mothers, and with Vasishtha right there, the great priest who is an all-knowing knower of Brahman. He got raised in the Dharma, he got raised in the truth. So when he went on pilgrimage and saw suffering, it wasn't for his own sake that he came back weeping. It was for the sake of all the people who hadn't had the benefit of hearing these teachings early, because Vasishtha himself, one of his great teachings is, if you're raised with the Dharma at the feet of the holy beings, you will never suffer these things. Instead, you're raised in time, the idea that time's being real, the idea that lust is there, the idea that old age is coming, the very idea that you were born, you're raised with those things, and so you're awaiting death. Therefore, he says, you're brooding on them. So this same Upanishad we're studying in a retreat in 2 weeks from now at Windward Waters, we hear that sentiment expressed in the Annapurna Upanishad too, when it says, don't finitize yourself. You're not going to want to brood upon body and birth and sankalpa. Those 2 things, 3 things really, you don't want to brood on them, because you invite them, Vasishtha says, you invite them into your thinking consciousness, and they plant themselves there, and they surplant the knowledge of Brahman. So you think only of the vision of the eternal moment right now, not of the idea of what happened before, what happened and what's going to happen in the future, but the eternal moment that the yogi lives in. About birth, he says that. About growth, asti, he says this. The illusion of growth is one of the mayic elements which attaches men and women to the ever-changing realm of name and form. Namarupa could be one of the things on this list very easily that he could have brought out and talked about. Vardhate is disease. Outside in the relative world, there are diseases which, though they have their origin in the subtle mind, manifest harshly in the body. A connection to make would be this, when this body gets diseased, that you can maybe help it from the outside with medicines, with exercise, with better eating, with so forth and so on. But if you never know that the origin of disease happens in the mind, that the seeds are not germs in the body, but are thoughts in the mind, then your defenses, what we like to call your mental immune system, gets broken down, and these diseases then in the body then get their opportunity to manifest themselves. But this is why, say, the yogis and a lot of the rishis, they feel their body getting sick and they revert automatically to this idea that disease is in the mind. Look for the seed there and shine the light on it, and then the body says, oh, well, maybe I'm not so sick after all. Maybe this is all just an experience that's happening to me that I don't need to partake of. I'll just put it off. See, I'll stamp on it. Same with ignorance in the mind. If you were in a forest and you came upon a little tiny fire, what would you do? Somebody had a campfire there, they didn't put it out, walked away, and there's a little fire there. You'd stamp it out right away, or the whole hillside would be gone. You come back. So you stamp out ignorance and thoughts of ignorance in the mind, just like you would stamp out a fire in a forest. Ignorance has to go, and then you would get down on your hands and knees and you would look and see if there are any sparks left in that fire you just stamped out, and drench them. Make sure it's completely out and will never come back again. So these are germs in the mind, and diseases are like that. It's one of the signature teachings of Lord Vasishtha, who is, remember, listening to this discourse and will later take the young Ramachandra aside and tell him how Vedanta deals with each one of these things in people. It doesn't, Sri Ram doesn't have any of these things to the extent of suffering. He just has this seed of Maya in his mind that the beings are suffering in a real way, in an actual way. But he's going to be taken to task by Vasishtha and shown how people's karmas bring their suffering, and when they transcend their karmas, then they're going to transcend their suffering too. That's one of the second things you do in the higher limbs of yoga, is transcend suffering. So that's something about Vardate, disease. It's in the subtle mind where these things begin. So you have to examine that, like snow conditions by an Eskimo, or like a person putting out a fire in a forest. Jara is old age. I'm going through all of them because these are called the 6 transformations. They're pretty much contained there in what we're talking about today. He says about old age, and these are things he's saying in the court to this congregation of people. Set upon by old age, a man is hardly even able to contemplate the soul's passage to higher worlds, much less meditate on reality. That's beautiful, because there are 2 things then that old age gives you or requires of you. First of all, where am I going next? And second, what is Brahman? Who am I? So both of those things, old age is trying to take away from you. You see, you're worrying about being old. Maybe your time hasn't even come yet. You've got another 10 years to live. But you're still thinking, oh, I'm old. So the mind, which we will talk about soon, manas, has gotten a hold of you in that sense and taken and robbed you of these 2 opportunities of old age. One is, where am I going to project myself next? Or maybe I can dissolve the need to project myself at all and just merge with Brahman. And number 2, I have to think about Brahman, and meditate and contemplate on Brahman. So this is what Jara does to the soul that is not informed by these great teachings. How about Kshara, decay? He says, with the life force literally squeezed out of the various human vessels, then comes the collapse and dissolution of the human frame into dust. Kshara, decay. And then Mara is the 6th one of these transformations. The Grim Reaper Yama moves among the young and aged alike, gathering heads like a farmer picking ripe melons before a seasonal harvest. Another teaching has death with its sickle going around in the pumpkin patch, cutting off pumpkins like old withered heads, gray-haired heads. So they use these very stark ways of saying to make one sit up and take stock of what I just talked about in terms of the passage of time, because these 6 transformations are happening in the passage of time, not beyond it. So you have to think non-dually as well as see the mind in its dual way from a distance. You see, we'll talk about that when we talk about manas and deha, how the body and mind are different but connected. There's the 6 passions underneath, and we'll play off of kama here, lust, krodha, anger, lobha, greed, moha, delusion, madha, vanity, matsarya, jealousy. Kama, krodha, lobha, moha, madha. You hear that said by Sri Krishna in the Gita, just like that in the sloka. He's talking about the 6 passions. And so there's a sloka which includes almost all of them. And Krishna is telling Arjuna about the problems of holding the 6 passions and how they get a hold of people's mindsets. The 6 billows are there, similar to the 6 transformations. I wanted to list them, but they have 2 differences. One is hunger, kshuha, and one is thirst, pipasa. So hunger and thirst are added in to another view of transformations. Then shoka, grief, Bhranti, delusion. There's jara again, dotage or old age, and there's mrityu, death, or kama. And then finally you hear about the 8 fetters. You see the chain link down below. Dvesha, Gotra, Bhaya, Varna, Hri, Darpa, Gopaniyata, and Shoka, which is like one of the 6 billows. So you see here, people are also suffering these grosser forms of the 6 passions. You might say, what happens when you engage then in lust and anger, then hatred comes about. You could make the connections that way. Gotra is pride of lineage. You see people caught in that fetter a lot. So it creates a sense of being better than other lineages, pride. So sometimes they add pride into this list too. Baya, freer. Varna, caste. You're restricted by your caste and can't move in and out of it. Hri, shame. Darpa, there's pride. Gopanyata, secrecy, which we're seeing in people nowadays who aren't following through with their word when they say something. And shoka, grief. Ashoka reminds us of a Swami Ashokananda, who taught in San Francisco for a long time, had that beautiful name, Swami Ashokananda, so he's always free of grief. See. Preoccupation with relative existence is to be transcended. When impeding factors such as the 6 transformations, the 6 passions, the 6 billows, the 8 fetters, the 3 gunas, and the pairs of opposites besiege mankind at every step, all of them attended by constant change and pervasive suffering, how desirable can worldly life really be? That's how I put it together, yours truly, in my own quote, when I wanted to convince people that those are your playmates, as Reese says, is how I used to teach these collection of problems. And there's more to add into them. There's the 9 antarayas, there's the 5 kleshas. In different systems you can go on listing these, and the seers have listed them, and that's why Sri Ram is talking about them. So Vasishtha is going to take him aside and say, listen, my son, here's how we deal with these. Here's how the tradition has dealt with these for ages, for eternity, for eternal ages, so that we can stamp out the forest fire of each one of these, the little campfire that they can turn into a forest fire through. So a quick look at the 6 transformations, 6 passions, 6 billows, and 8 fetters. We want to keep with the tradition and read something about these from Ram's own words, because each one of these things we've been encountering, I've been taking a little section out of the great scripture Yoga Vasishtha, which you'll find on the shelves and you can look into and read how, not only how Ram gives this discourse, but how Vasishtha handles it after the fact and teaches him for weeks thereafter to remove these things. So he says a few things here we want to take up. On the chart, and I meant to mention it before if I didn't last week, remember we were looking at last week at prana, life force, and ahamkara, ego. Do you remember that? We took a good look at the 5 pranas chart and the 5 psychic pranas that connect to them. We spent a long time on prana, and then we looked at ahamkara, the ego, the individual self. And the solution I didn't really get to, although I probably did in the discourse, but on the chart, prana was the beautiful way to deal with that, is to spend it engaged in Atmic inquiry. It's just a beautiful way in which it gets concluded. So what are we saying here? Your life force is being spent. You can look at one of the God blogs we posted just last week called Pranic Bloodsuckers. And we have a picture of a leech there sucking on a person's arm. See, so the whole implication is that there are leeches that aren't just sucking your blood, but they're leeches that you've placed in your own mind and on your energy, on your nadis, that are distracting you and sucking out your life force, which should be given more towards things like Atmic inquiry, or towards meditation, or towards study of scriptures, or towards worship. And these spiritual practices that you hear about that do away with these, right? You won't have to stamp out any forest fires if you're doing that, or any campfires either. You'll keep everything well drenched with the water of spiritual practice. And as far as the solution for ahamkara, renunciation is the solution for that. We're going to have a seminar next month called How Does a Householder Renounce? So you can be on hand for that, because we know how the monks renounce and it looks good on them for the most part. the householders, if they can renounce, what would it look like? Deny the ego what it wants. That's what it looks like. You just don't allow it to have anything. When it wants something particularly, it hankers after it, you say, you don't get that. It's like a petulant child that wants things for itself all the time, so it's selfish, and it gets used to them, and it gets used to having them, and when they're taken away, it falls into the ninefold road to ruination. Look that up in the Gita if you want to see how fun that is. So you deny the ego what it wants. People talk about renunciation being premature or dangerous. In Western psychology particularly, that's not the idea. You work with the ego and deny it what it wants, and you give it the higher self. You can see then how prana and ego have a connection here. If you want to use your prana to spend it in Atmic inquiry, then at the same time you're going to have to take away from the ego everything that it wants, because those are the very things that are acting as pranic bloodsuckers. So you take those things away, the ego begins to ripen, and it contributes to the spiritual path. And if you want to know about beautiful, ripe cosmic egos, then you just look at the Trinity, or you look at a great avatar, and you find the result of having done those practices manifested right there in them. So you might say these are kind of obvious teachings, but when you get into talking about them, looking at them in terms of how you suffer them, even if it's the residues of them are still there in the mind, and the ego is still wanting things that it shouldn't have, and you're allowing that to happen, then you know why they teach these things and why they keep reminding you to stamp out that forest fire or that campfire. So those two things I wanted to go back on and remind us of in this series. Use your life force to seek realization or enlightenment, and teach your ego how to renounce things. Give it the strength to say no to things that are not good for it. Even take away things that are good for it. No, you don't get that. You don't get anything. That's the best way to deal with the ego if you can. Because when it gets things that are good for it, then it gets attached to those. And we know that good and bad are chains that hold. One of iron, one of gold. So the negative things are iron chains. The good things are gold chains. They both bind. And what you want in yoga and in Vedanta and in any higher religion like Buddhism and so forth is to transcend, what did we just say? The pairs of opposites. That's what he's talking about. Go beyond the pairs of opposites, like the quote there says. See, you want to go beyond these deluding pairs of opposites. So let's see what Ram says in his own words about which one shall we pick, because we've got several. About old age, let's pick that one. Apakshyate, it's there on the list. After the helplessness of infanthood and the irrationality of youth, the infirmity of old age and dotage comes upon mankind. At that state of life, the intelligence of a worldly man, if he had any to begin with, abandons him, and he begins to talk nonsense. His family, friends, relatives, and others either revile his company at that time or laugh at him behind his back, or both. Desires attend upon that mind, along with an enraged sense of helplessness at not being able to satisfy them due to the feebleness of the body. This is nothing short of a hellish existence, Ram says. Fears and doubts take up residence in the mind in hordes, like owls nesting in the hollows of an old tree. Such a mind is unable to meditate on the soul's passage from the body to higher worlds, much less keep the mind fixed on God, which is reality. And this is the time of death, no doubt, and that grim reaper Yama moves among the aged, gathering old graying heads like a farmer picks pumpkins from the vine at the time of seasonal harvest. So that's what he says to the court of the king about apakshyate, right there. So a march of the armies of disease is the analogy he uses, and he wants then engage in sadhana and meditation. That's time. Practice continence and moderation. So basically you would have had to have done that before old age is the problem. So you want to be raised in the Dharma by parents who have gotten the Dharma from their parents and their grandparents in a lineage. And that's the best use for a lineage that we were talking about here. It can be a transformation, one of the 6 transformations, but if there's no pride involved in it, like if the pride of the 8 fetters is taken out of the picture, then you've got something to be very, very encouraged by when you look at a dharmic family line like that. All of this comes after his discourse on the Jayate, infancy, and Vardhate, youth. That might take a while to read, but that's why I decided to go straight to old age and dotage, because we don't want to end up in that position where we're without prana. Our ego's not been surrendered to the Lord. You can sort of see how this goes in a series of things. That's why I said in the first Sunday class, he starts out with a false superimposition, and wants you to see the truth early on in life, and so that root ignorance doesn't get a hold, and so desires don't get in, and so you don't falsely identify with things. If those first 4 things which we spent so much time on can be aided by the flow, pure flow of prana, and a diminished ego, what they call a ripened ego, then what we're about to talk about next, manas and deha, mind and body, will be in good shape. And they won't have to experience the downside of youth, growth, and old age. We see many people who decide that they're never going to be old. They've heard the teaching of being eternally young. Their Atman is birthless, deathless, and they just decide that's where they're going to spend the rest of their life, in that set of mind. And there's no reason why they shouldn't. It's going to be healthy for them all around to do that. So just wanted to spend a little time in the short time that we have on the 6 transformations and the 6 passions, 8 fetters. It's all implied in those 4. Jayate, Vardhate, Kama, and Apaksyate. And I connected it with time there because it all happens in time, in cycles of time, which we're learning to extract ourselves from. So let's look then about manas and deha, as we've seen what he said to the court about these things. So we made a big jump there, and we can lead ourselves back to this mind. He calls it the root of duality and the cause of objects. That's the complaint, if you can see there on the chart. It's the root of duality. So that duality he's talking about, the root is the subject-object relationship that you hear so much about, talked about in Vedanta, in Buddhism, and in yoga. The subject-object relationship. I remember my teacher simplifying that for us. You're not the object, you're the eternal subject. See? So put your mind on the eternal subject and forget these infernal objects. The eternal subject, the infernal object. It was an interesting way in which it would be put there. Because the objects can then take your mind into a state of duality where you think that you're enjoying, you think you're owning, and you're having these experiences that bring about some of these problems that we just talked about. You want to forego that, if at all possible. So mind, manas, root of all duality, but it's also the cause of objects. That's to be taken literally. Nature couldn't do it alone. Had to be a sentient force we call Purusha behind the Prakriti. Most systems of materialism and so forth, and science and so forth, pretty much just believe in nature, and with no soul behind it or in it or throughout it. But right away in early India, Samkhya talked about two eternal subjects, Purusha, Prakriti. Purusha's first. Prakriti lives for Purusha. That is, it takes everything and from the Purusha's light, and then it gives it back to Purusha in different forms. So if you have this ripened sense of a higher duality, you might say, then you won't fall victim to this problem of duality, and you'll know where the causes of objects are. You won't go looking for them out in physical space. You'll look for them back in your mind, where they originated. And we'll show you the rest of the mind-only schools in a minute, because we didn't finish that chart last week, we only started it. So this is by way of Ram's complaint. You want to ask me about the mind? This is what I'm telling you. It's the root of all duality, and it's the cause of objects. He goes right to the source. As far as an analogy, he says it's like a wicker basket unable to hold water. You start out for home and you get a basket, and you remember you were asked to bring water home, so you pour a bunch of water in your basket. By the time you get home, it's all leaked out. So that's what the mind is like, he says, by way of analogy or metaphor. It's unable to hold the water. The water there would be remembrance of divine reality, of the Atman, of the divine self. It just leaks out of the mind. You must know this yourself by the way the mind searches for things and comes up with all of these. Uses its energy, prana, to look for things. We just said that. It gets to the ego, and the ego inflates and wants to own and possess things when, number one, those things are insubstantial. Number two, they came out of the very mind that's seeking them. So this is the way they reason about it in these mind-only schools and in the deeper philosophies and darshanas of India. What about a solution for the mind? Can you boil it down to such a thing, purify it, and use it to gain liberation? So here we have our most recent authority on the subject, Sri Sharda Devi, the Holy Mother. This mind is very crucial to you at this stage, my son, my daughter. You must use it to get to Brahman, so take very good care of it. So if you were to look back on what Ram's talking about, taking good care of it wouldn't be to increase the sense of actuality about dualities. You'd want to try and make the dual mind non-dual. And number two, you'd see that the mind is the source of everything via sankalpa and samskaras, which we will not get to today either, but we looked at samskaras back at false superimposition when we first started this series 4 weeks ago. But in that way, then the mind is got this problem of creating impressions based on desires, which we did look at, vasanas. Vasana samskaras, they're called. And then those lodge in the mind. A good analogy, like owls in an old tree. He just used that analogy. Or like bats in a barn. So they just lodge there in that mind and take those very things from lifetime to lifetime and come back with them. Maybe that's where the saying bats in the belfry came from. Or that person has bats in the belfry. Their mind is not in a very good, fine and fettle shape. So that's how we look at mind across the spectrum of this chart. Let's read then what he says about mind so we get that done. It's short, it is very to the point. And he's just got done talking about the ego, which we read last week. So he says, apart from the ego element, this mind we entertain is another grave matter as well. Manas, it's called, is the dual mind. is slung high and low, dragged here and there by a howling host of dualities that never knows silence or resolution. This mundane and ordinary mind, if left unpurified by spiritual practices, behaves like a homeless mongrel, wandering here and there, looking for table straps, tossed out of the door by humble villagers. On the other hand, if any bliss of higher things does come to it, this poor mind fails to hold on to it for its own good, like a straw basket which fails to contain water. All the worlds, all objects come from this mind. From heavens to earth to the lower patalas, this mind carries us in a matter of seconds, leaving hardly any room for rest in the interim. Wherever the mind is present, there appears the universe, and when it is turned off, like in deep sleep, the universe dissolves. Therefore, I am seriously thinking of late that it should be annihilated. For all that is good and bad, painful and pleasurable, arise from it in repetitive turns and in cycles unending. Well, at about this time, if you were thinking Sri Ram was just the perfect son of King Dasaratha, or he was just a young man that had listened to the priests, you'd probably forsake those perspectives. And you start thinking, how does he know this? He must have examined the mind to its very root with all that he has said here. For instance, from heaven to earth to hell, this mind carries us in a matter of seconds. All objects have come out of it. That's not common knowledge, particularly for a young person, what to speak of even an old soul. So you're automatically thinking that this is the unveiling of an avatar right there who has scrutinized the mind down to its very impressions and seen its dual side. And what we'll look at, hopefully before we end the class, is the non-dual mind, what that is as compared to this. So keep this in mind as we look at and finish this chart on mind-only schools, because we started into that last week. So that's very inspiring to read that by this probably 14-year-old young man. And as I say, it's very interesting that people might not know him yet, but when they hear this, how did he know that? How did he know that all objects come out of the mind when that's rare knowledge? And how does he know that it's the mind that takes you from birth to death, to life, to rebirth back again, through a whole series of inner worlds? Who would know that? Even in that age, that was considered rare knowledge. That's why he's worthy of veneration, and we would sing to him. Sarva Mangala Koshalendriya Mahaniya Gunabdaye Chakravarti Tanujaya Sarva Bhaumaya Mangalam Shri Sita Ramachandra Sita Ramachandra Shri Sita Ramachandra Shri Sita Ramachandra Shri Sita Ramachandra Shri Sita Ramachandra Veda Vedanta Vedyaya Mega Shamala Murtaye Pumsha Mohana Rupaya Punya Shlokaya Mangalam Shri Sita Ramachandra 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 Shri Sita Ramachandra. And on, verse after verse, this beautiful stotram to both Sita and Ramachandra goes. So good to bring it up in this fourth class or fifth class, because today is Mother's Day, so we don't want to forget Mother Sita, who stands behind Sri Ram and stood behind him one of the, if not one of the greatest women of all of India, which is saying a lot. Now let's look and finish this teaching about pumpkins. India's mind-only school perspective. Some of the darshanas are specifically called mind-only school. I happen to believe that they're all mind-only schools when you study India's darshanas. Perhaps one or two exceptions. But the mind-only school here means that they know, as Ram just told the court, this mind takes us from heaven to earth to hell. It takes us from higher to lower. It takes us from waking to dream to deep sleep. And all the objects and worlds actually that we go to come out of it. So it provides everything to travel in, and then it takes the mind like a chariot behind the five senses of the five horses, and a chariot through those worlds and back again. So again, it's an amazing bit of knowledge that he's coming up with there, probably higher than knowledge, wisdom. So we looked at the bottom part of this chart to explain this. They're the five elements, which I chanted at the beginning of this class. Na Vyoma, Na Teja, No Vayu. I'm none of the elements, and I'm none of the senses. That's next. I'm not the physical body either. Mano Buddha Hamkara. Chittani Naham. I'm not the mind. I'm not the vital force, which he just talked about here in terms of prana, we studied last week. And then there's the senses and the prana going up the middle of all these things, to the ancestors. So if you look at the sidebar here, cut open a pumpkin, put it beside there, you can see what's in it. The mind projects what? And of course, here we're talking about the internal mind. I'm planning a chart that is probably going to be called Mind and Consciousness, Brain and Body. So those are two sets. Mind and consciousness are connected to one another. Brain and body are connected to one another. The two are different. They have a connection via these very things. But the mind is different than the brain, is the point. And people are focusing on the brain only, in the brain only, and they're not finding the secrets to the mind's ability to take you to heaven, to the ancestors, or to the celestial realm, or to the gods and goddesses. That's missing from there on down, you see, because they're not aware if the mind is the kingdom of heaven within you. So if they took that teaching that Jesus said later, thousands of years before Jesus, they took that seriously from the seers, and they began thinking of life, birth, death, rebirth, objects, nature, everything in it, in that very way. It all came from the mind. So they had hundreds and thousands of years of living with that truth. I would say with that relative truth. And that's where mind-only schools come from. So you take that perspective. Otherwise, you step out into the human body from the mother's womb, and you find yourself here with the five elements and the five senses, and you just enjoy them without thinking where they came from. And suffering comes to you, and then ignorance follows. And then you're in an age where no one around you knows how to help you out of that. Parents, grandparents, your ancestors that you can recall back for hundreds of years had no idea how they were born, where they came from, whence they went afterwards. So it's all a complete mystery to them. And wisdom reads like a foreign language. They can't understand it. And that's the predicament of an age like this, as we were saying. So what does this internal mind project? There you see there in very tiny letters, there's an eternal ocean of matter, Ekarnava. This ocean of matter is solid things and invisible things. It's manifested Prakriti and it's unmanifested Prakriti. So Prakriti divides itself, nature divides itself into two things. It's the first thing that we don't see, which is subtle, back in the subtle mind, and it's made of seeds. Everything is made of seeds. Everything here comes out of seeds. There are 6 types of beings born here. And some of them, the higher souls, are born from seeds. Others are born from moisture and so forth, insects. But those ones that are born from seeds are counted as more substantial life forms. So there's an ocean of matter behind this mass of matter here, because most of what's out here is rather solid. Earth is the main thing. Water is solid in its liquidity. Air is solid in its mass. So we're talking about one great ocean of matter here that has solidified before us. But whereas you can't see ether, you can infer air by the wind. So all of this is something that's on the outside of nature. So this is half of Ekarnava. The other half is a subtle ocean of matter, which all these things came from, which are the seeds. And that's why the pumpkin makes a very good analogy for this way of thinking and this way of understanding where everything came from. So first, think about unmanifested Prakriti and manifested Prakriti. Don't just think about what you hear, taste, touch, see, and smell in terms of solid objects. Then you can get to these subtler principles that mind projects. So you can see on one side, one of these seeds says races on it. One says bodies. One says worlds. One says nature itself. On the other side, objects come from this mind. The gods come from this mind, and God itself comes from this mind. God as a concept, that is, comes from this very mind. When you're in deep sleep, you're not thinking about God, and when you're in samadhi, you're not thinking about God. You are God there. And so you realize that the idea of God came from a concept in your mind, but that mind had to be very elevated, and it had to have faith, and it had to have devotion in order to see things as God, so that you could experience them as Brahman. We'll switch to the Sanskrit word for God here. In order to become that, in order to know that you always are that, to be Brahman. And all of those things will be facilitated, as Holy Mother said, by the mind, by the mind's fine and fettle shape. Otherwise, everything gets reduced to suffering, ignorance, forgetfulness. And all of these things are forgotten. Like we've forgotten ancestors here in America. We've forgotten gods. We've forgotten angels and celestials, except for a little bit cross-section of religion. And we don't really know that much about the Trinity and higher principles like that. So if you took a pumpkin and cross-sectioned it like that, and this pumpkin was the mind, you'd see that all these seeds in it represented these kinds of unknown, unseen, forgotten principles that we bring back and study when we study the Samkhya Yoga, or when we study Yoga and Vedanta. And this is all below the line of the ancestors. So the subtle mind projected the ancestors here too, didn't it? So if you start there, you're talking about subtle tattvas. There are 24 more that go beyond these 12, basically. When you look at the 24 tattvas, there are 24 of them. And then if you look at what's beyond them, beyond the individual soul, Purusha, then they begin to think that when we went there beyond the Purusha and we saw ourselves closer to Brahman, we picked up on 12 other cosmic principles that were there. And this is where we bring out the charts on Shaivism and show these. But basically, you can see that this is where you're going to become in tune with ancestors, celestials, devas and devis, gods and goddesses, and these are all existing in the mind. So the mind has an individual, then a collective, then a cosmic aspect to it. It's threefold. In the beginning, you thought it was dual. You see, that's that dual mind that gave you all these problems. So now you're dividing it up into a more cogent way of looking at it, that it has a cosmic level to it. And those things, the cosmic Trinity, for instance, manifests, lands at a very fine and subtle level, which is much finer matter than this. This is where you go back to Ekarnava, and you see that nature has a gross side to it, but nature also has a subtle side to it, like a liquefied side to it, that flows through the mind. And you can go to a heaven, leave heaven. You could go to a higher world, leave that. Consciousness becomes facile. It begins to go inward. And if it brings consciousness to its dreams and to its deep sleep state, then it begins to have experiences in these lokas, in these akashas, in these bardos, in these kingdoms of heaven, in these worlds within. There are many words for it in different traditions where seers have actually seen them, gone inside, shut off the external senses, and begin to see and examine the seeds inside this pumpkin head they have. The pumpkin is said may be just the brain. To show how this is both grand and ridiculous, let's see what Swami Vivekananda says about it. And it is this Lord we are trying to realize from time without beginning in the objective. And in the attempt, our minds throwing up such queer creatures of our fancy as man, woman, child, body, brain, earth, sun, moon, stars, the world, love, hate, property, wealth, etc., also ghosts, devils, angels, gods, and God, etc. You see what he's saying there is this one consciousness that's formless we're trying to make into an object. And all these, it sounds like Gaudapada in his Karke a lot, and all these objects are really manufactured by the mind. So that's why Sri Ram is standing in front of there and saying, I'm beginning to see why this mind has to be eradicated. Because he's looked into it and saw all the wonders, all the preposterousness of it, because it's all empty. And it's all changing constantly, and it's full of the 6 passions, the 8 fetters, the 6 transformations, the 9 antarayas, the 5 kleshas. All of that is in it. So why am I holding it and using it again and again to project worlds of name and form and time and space based in Maya? So this is a very, very deep inspection of the mind by a very, very ancient and primal soul who is standing in front of you as a 14-year-old boy. This is the beauty of Adhyatma Ramayana and Yoga Vasishtha, these 2 scriptures that we're drawing all of this out today in a much later age. We're so fortunate to have it with us, and that it can be actually made clear to our minds if we qualify ourselves a little bit in the divine wisdom of Mother India, in the Sanatana Dharma. And since we want to leave time for mind at its non-dual state, because that's probably where a lot of the seekers of today are going with this. Well, okay, we get your point there, Babaji. There's a mind's full of good, bad, pleasure, pain, life, death. It's full of objects, it's full of non-objects, it's full of intelligence, it's full of non-intelligence. Every duality that you can possibly think of is harbored like bats in a barn in that mind. And it will come forth in time over cycles, when people believe in cycles of time and the power of their minds to project things based in some scars that they've been holding for lifetimes. I see it all connected now. I'm beginning to see it. But what happens to a person who sees it and transcends it is what we want to end this 5-class series on. So we had just enough time to probably to look at that. That would be this incomparable view that an Advaita Vedantist has. And incomparable is a good word for it too. Because some of the souls, they inspected Maya, Prakriti, Pradhana, cosmic principles, senses, objects, prana, for us, so that they could tell us where we were going with them. Oh, be careful of that. Might as well put a little cautionary sign on each one of these things, right? False superimposition, false identification, desires, ignorance. Isn't it pretty apparent that this is the bitter that turns into the sweet later? But if you consider it real, it's the sweet that will turn bitter, as Krishna says in the Gita, very soon in your lifetime, or a series of lifetimes even worse. So with that known, once they did inform us of the mind, the dual mind, which is, you might say, kind of the hub of everything here. It's right in the middle, with these below, these above. The mind is responsible for almost everything here. And the ego is just a part of that mind, because if you ripen the ego, it swiftly takes it runs away from the mind, the dual mind, and begins to ripen, and it begins to turn into a view that it has of itself, which is much, much, much better than I am a body-mind mechanism, or I am a psychophysical being. These are ways in which Vedanta would explain it, and that's why I chanted Chidananda Rupaha Shivoham Shivoham at the beginning of the class today. I sang that from Shankara, whose birthday was 2 days ago. This is, I'm none of those things. I am Chid Ananda. I am the bliss of consciousness. I'm the very form of that. Rupaha. I am actually Shiva, Shiva. If you're going to put me in a form, put me in the form of Shiva. Because Shiva can destroy everything that's been projected in a thrice. He's got that power. He'll end an age and bring about another age. He'll end a cycle of ages, a Mahayuga, and bring about the next one after Pralaya. So people are looking at this great soul Shiva with as much reverence and as much love and devotion as they do to Vishnu or to Lord Brahma, who started off the whole shoot match. So he'll give you also this incomparable view when you approach him. Shakti approaches Shiva, then she's going to get an eyeful, and he'll get a return eyeful when he sees what she does with his wisdom. Because there are worlds like Maharloka, Taparloka, Janaloka, Brahmaloka, which are far beyond the three lower worlds in which all of these things are happening. Bur, Bhuva, Swaha. Far beyond those three worlds where the ancestors are becoming humans and then turning back into ancestors in cycles of time. So all of that is to be looked at, scrutinized, and they have done that for us, given us these teachings, these conclusions. Vedanta Siddhanta Nirukti Resha Brahmaiva Jivaham Sakalam Jagadcha. Yes, all of this, time, space, living beings in the world is unreal. See, but Brahman is real in it. That's the divine conclusion. That's the Vedanta Siddhanta. Brahmadvaitye, that is one without a second. It means that's the one thing in many things. That's the one abiding essence in the appearance of many things. So both are real at that point. Brahman and the things that are projected by the mind, both real, because Brahman has been put in front. If you have a long line of zeros, Ramakrishna said, adds up to nothing in the end. That's true both of your desires and the three worlds, but it's also true in philosophy, where if you add up everything that you know, it adds up to nothing in the end, unless Brahman is put first. That's the one, or the not two, in all of things. And that's what Shiva represents here. When you come to a place where I've done the best I can for the three worlds, now let me tell you about what's beyond them. This is an incomparable view. You're going to have to qualify yourself for this. Like King Himalaya had the baby girl. That was Uma. Talk about a divine incarnation. This was the goddess herself that came into human form with him and his queen. King Himalaya is the king of the mountains, king of the snow mountains. So she comes out. He realizes she's the divine mother. She can't speak yet. He waits. She learns words. Her memory starts coming back, just like Ram's is here. And all of a sudden he sees that she can understand him. He starts asking her for things. I know you're the Divine Mother. Can you give me a vision of this, vision of that God, vision of that goddess? Can you tell me the truth of that thing? And so she says, certainly, Father, yes, here they are. And she just fulfills all of his desires. And everything he wants to know is given to him by the Divine Mother in this little tiny form. Then he finally runs out of things to think about and says, oh, well, I remember one thing. Can you give me the knowledge of non-duality? She's silent. I said, can you give me the knowledge of non-reality? Finger goes up. I'm sorry, Father. I cannot give you that. For that, you have to live with illumined souls. So these illumined souls, holy company we call them, is where you get this incomparable view. So let's look at it. It's broken down basically into these three levels for us. Brahman, God, self, equate to one another. Mind, of course, that's where mind is so important. Finally, the world itself. So let's see what they say about these things. The top quote first. Non-duality is not a philosophy. It is the natural, transparent, and all-pervasive verity underlying all things, all phenomena, all beings, and everything that constantly undergoes change and cycles. Gaudapada has declared that it is the obvious and simple truth, the essence of existence, uncontestable in all realms of the world's religions and philosophies. Non-duality is incomparable, in other words, and it has no argument with any other school, dualism particularly. It just states itself as being the one singular truth underlying everything. So down the first pillar here, because it was put in terms of three pillars so that we can see it, if you are in possession of a non-dual perspective, and you've gone so deep as to conclude this, Vedanta Siddhanta, then you deny transformation and accept non-origination. I quoted Saturday, my teacher, Swami Sheshanandaji Maharaj, science is beginning to think that matter may be indestructible. It's not indestructible, nor is it destructible. It's unoriginated. When I heard him say that, I practically fell off the pew I was sitting on at the Vedanta Society that day. I had wanted to hear that so much, and it solved all the problem of science, which is dualism really, pretty much, fundamentalism to a great extent, materialism for sure, that there was something called the unoriginated. And then Advaita Vedanta began to open itself. And I began to search for this incomparable view. And it's what's behind everything that Sri Ramakrishna taught and had his samadhis in. He would always go back to that, and that he associated with Mother Kali, the highest aspect of Divine Mother, who was born and manifested in Sri Sharda Devi, his own divine consort. So this is a powerful thing. You deny transformation. What did we just talk about? 6 of them, right? Birth, growth, old age, decay, death. 6 transformations. You say those are not true. My view is non-originated. They're all unoriginated. They don't have a beginning, middle, and end. There's no source to them. They're unreal. They're only real when seen as existing in Brahman, like even Maya, poison in the snake. Maya, that's why Shankara said, neither real nor unreal, nor a combination of both. How can I say, oh, I've got a word for you in English, inscrutable. It just can't be figured, but it exists. It exists in Brahman. Sometimes Brahman even becomes overwhelmed by its own Maya, Sri Ramakrishna said humorously. So that's a first law of a pillar, you see. What's the second one? You must see beyond evolution and involution into all-pervasive stasis, the steadiness of all things. If it's all-pervasive, it doesn't have to move, I used to say. Things have to move when they want to become something, when they want to get something, when they want to leave something behind. That's movement. It's all kind of a dream, nonsense that's going on, Vivekananda said. But if it's all-pervasive, it's just is there as the substratum of everything, doesn't need to go anywhere, come from somewhere. It connects back to denying transformation, but it goes deep in this way, is that if you only are aware of evolution, which sadly most of us are today in this world, in this time, and you have been left no route to go back in. Where's going back in? Shall I show it to you again? The seeds of the pumpkin, going back in to the ancestors, to the celestials, to the gods and goddesses, to the Trinity, to Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva themselves. You're denied that access to your own self, in which all of those things exist. That's called evolution without involution. And if you get a hold of the truth of involution through Sanatana Dharma, you'll reach this incomparable view. Then both evolution and involution will be seen as unreal. Neither of them happen. And that because they were what? Transformations. And transformations only take place where? In the mind. The senses are connected to the mind. They'll believe in the transformations out here and tell the mind and ego, you must get those things. They're not telling you don't get those things. Don't go after them. If you have them, renounce them right now. You'll be free and happy if you do. Why do you think the seers are free and happy? Next assignment on the pillar observes time and space as relative laws that ultimately dissolve into a timeless awareness. Birthless, deathless, nameless, formless, timeless. Those are the words, all less, less, less. Doesn't it sound like renunciation to you? So you're not only going to have to renounce all these things that the ego's after, you're going to have to renounce those things that higher mind is going after, like knowledge and so forth. Those things you'll have to let go of after you use them. For this higher involution to take place that ends you up at this incomparable view of Advaita, Vedanta, or non-duality. You can then observe time and space as relative laws. You don't have to kick them out of the picture. There are too many hundreds and thousands of people who still believe in them. And you want to get them out of that belief. No doubt you do. Why would Ram come back and go through all this trouble in front of some very astute people? And not just the suffering people outside of the Kosala kingdom that he saw and got sobered by. He's come back in an age that's full of people who still understand these Dharma teachings from older ages, to do just that, get them off this merry-go-round of cycles of time, of thinking that the ego and the body and life is real and death is real. They're not. The first pillar tells me this. And that's my incomparable view. That's where he's sitting, you see. I photoshopped him in, you see, in this pillar's picture. He's just watching all these worlds that are behind here, behind these three pillars. Castles, people, armies going to war. I faded him back so we could see the teachings. But he's just sitting there watching these in a completely neutral state. Completely equal. Not vesting any of the 6 passions in them, not getting attached to any of the 8 fetters that could come from watching it, not falling into the influence of the 5 kleshas that could come from being a part of it, completely detached from it and beyond it, with this incomparable view that has not only saved him, it's liberated him for all time, from cycles of time. Well, 3 pillars of Advaita Vedanta is the name of these. So we've looked at these very 4. I mean, there are Sanskrit words that if you knew them, like aparinama or ajativada, if you knew them and what they meant, even though I put this in very few words, you'd automatically go into the samadhi of knowledge. Ah, yes, aparinama. Transformations are all not real. So why am I getting so bent out of shape by the things that happen to me every day? When they're not real. They shouldn't have any effect on me whatsoever. I should be witnessing them from the safe refuge of my own Atman, which can never be finitized, as the Upanishads tell us. Do not allow yourself to be finitized. Let's look at the second pillar. We might not have time to get to all the richness here. This is being recorded. So you go back and freeze the camera. Maybe this can be seen from inside of the class. Or get the book, Footfalls of the Indian Rishis, that I put out, there's charts in it, and just study all of these beautiful side teachings about these views. But let's continue on finishing the pillars in the time we have. The second pillar is called mind, of course. But remember, we're focusing on this incomparable view. What does it do? Frees the small self from the dream of finitude and attains non-transmigration. We're stepping down and out a bit. We took the most serious first, but this is how a mind should act. We're putting this in contrast to how the mind is acting when it suffers these, right? That's why we're bringing this chart into it. So it will free that small self, this ahamkara there, and ripen it by freeing it from the dream of being a finite soul. I'm an individual. I'm not an individual. I'm indivisible. That's how you deal with finitization being foisted upon you. It perceives birth, life, and death as mental dreams and becomes ever awake. It hears about something like yogic insomnia and wants it because it saw it in its teacher, if the teacher was a good teacher, an illumined soul. Not just short of, or let's say far short of just taking the experiences that you have every day as being unreal. Oh, it's gone now, it's past. Anyone can do that. Most anyone, they shouldn't get attached to things that happen to them, good or bad. I mean, that's kind of a common teaching, so you should at least be able to do that. But what it's asking you to do here is to see birth, life, and death as a mental dream. Itself a cycle, which is a mental dream. So it must be that you fashioned that dream from a detached place, which is your own witness. You chose your parents, as Tibetan Buddhism teachings say. You chose the country you're going to be born in. You chose your gender, and so forth and so on. You were born to do the certain work that you decided to do, and you put a few realized souls in your path when you came walking around. People say that, oh, I actually connected you to that teacher. No, I connected that before you were born. What do you mean? You didn't do anything. Read my Advaitic lips. You do everything yourself from before the time you're born. You chose all of this. Your guru, your path, everything. If you're not a good chooser, then you suffered by wrong choices, that's all. And this is just a matter of karma and its effects. There was no God that chose for you to suffer and then later on said, ha ha, I told you so. This is not the incomparable view. This is the untenable, non-acceptable view of the fundamentalist that tells you there's a God that did everything for you. If that were true, then I wouldn't want to worship that God, Vivekananda would say, because it put me into all that trouble. So that was you that put you into all that trouble. And it's you that will get you out of it. It should be you that should have never gotten you into it in the first place. And it wouldn't have if you had have had this incomparable view. We're studying. What else does this view mean? Realizes that activity, movement, and karma, which we were just talking about, all take place in nature, not in the soul. Excuse me, but don't excuse me. I'm borrowing this from Sri Krishna in the Gita. He put it the most clearly of all the advices, non-dual knowers of truth, is that all things happen in nature, Arjuna, not in your soul. Know your soul, and these things won't happen to you. You will come to know that these things aren't happening to you. They're happening just in nature, and nature is not real. It's a cyclic thing. Go back and study that transformation's not real to know that cycles aren't real. Connect the dot. Then the one above it, let's not forget that one, renders the functions and import of matter into life force into the Devatma Shaktim. Beautiful. Renders the functions and the import of matter and life force into Devatma Shaktim. Good one to include there, since we were looking at both of those, prana and so forth, in this chart that we've been studying. And it reminds us of Te Jan Yoga Nugata Apasyan Devatma Shaktim Sagunair Nagudam Yaha Karnani Nikilani Tani, and so forth. Kalatma Yuktanya Didishtat Yeka. So there's that full chart in the Svetashvatara Upanishad. The Devatma Shaktim, that's where you want to place everything into. That's like the spiritual bank. You see, you've got all these riches. What am I going to do with them? Can you take them, Mother? Well, sure I will, because they're mine to begin with. Whatever gave you the thought that they were yours in the first place? Give them back. So you give it all back. You pay it all back to the Devatma Shaktim. Devatma, divine, Shaktim, energy, the divine energy in everything, which that prana is a part of. And then we already took up, realize this activity, movement, and karma take place in nature, not in the soul. We have a few minutes where I think we can wrap it up by taking this third pillar of the world. We're stepping from non-dual view to mind to world. It's very, very effective when you look at it this way. Just make the shift in your mind with it. Don't hold the world accountable to this, you see, because it doesn't know about this. But for you as a devotee, as an aspirant, you hold this first, and then you look at the world. That's the way it can be explained. So at the top of that pillar, this incomparable view reveals the truth of spirituality and enlightenment beyond the pale of social and religious conventions. People are totally vested in and believe fully in social conventions and religion, fundamentalist, dualistic religion. But this view strips that away and reveals the truth that spirituality is beyond religion, and enlightenment outstrips social conventions. In other words, enlightenment is what society should be looking for. That's India did, and succeeded in doing, because all the great kings and queens that were ruling India were listening to the sannyasins. They would bring him into their castles. Can you inform our priests of the truth? They seem to have forgotten it. Yes, here's the truth. I've been meditating on it as I wondered about the worlds. And I can give it to you right now. Then you base your new laws on them. And make sure Dharma is first and foremost. Worship the goddess of Dharma first and foremost. She's the Devatma Shaktim that you want there in your laws. And then that set of laws will last for another few hundred years. And then I'll come back again and remind you that social conventions and society itself, its main goal, as Buddha told it, should be nirvana. You must go beyond the beyond all goals. Gatam, Paragatam, to the Paragatam, the supreme goal. This view will lift sleeping souls out of lifetimes of ignorance with their ancestors. Talk about a loaded statement. Reminds me of the man who got 3 wishes. Or no, actually he got 1 wish. God appeared to him and he said, God said, what do you want? He said, well, I want to eat sumptuous foods on gold plates with my grandchildren. Clever man. You know, 3 things in one, right? So he's ensuring through God's blessing that he will have sumptuous food, so he'll never go hungry or starve. He will also have gold plates, so he will be wealthy, and he will also have grandchildren, so he'll have long life. That's what that reminds me of. See, lift sleeping souls out of lifetimes of ignorance with their ancestors. If you don't figure in the ancestors, that ignorance is not going to go away. You might be free for one lifetime. You'll go back with them, and they'll teach you how to be ignorant again. Penultimately, prescribe sadhana rather than works and wealth as a solution for suffering, illness, and death. This really brings a nice end to this chart that we've taken 5 classes to look at and even not completed yet. Basically, it's exactly what Ram is talking about here. Not works and wealth, not through billions of dollars or hundreds and thousands of asanas or 5 million breathing exercises, nor an endless amount of works will enlightenment be gained, only through spiritual practice. Who am I quoting or paraphrasing? Swami Vivekananda and Shankara. I put him in there too. Finally, moves through work, duty, and dharma to the goal of non-dual wisdom and love of God. The 2 wings of the void, as my Indian Swami used to say. Past work and duty, even going beyond dharma, as Krishna says, and Ram says too in the Adhyatma Ramayana, to the goal of non-dual wisdom and love of God. Those 2 together, as is so beautifully instanced in these teachings. Andara Rama, Bahira Rama, Jahade Kota Rama, He Rama Rama Rama, Jagata Rama, Sovata Rama, Sapne Me Deko, Raja Rama Rama Rama, Shri Sita Ramachandra, Shri Sita Ramachandra, Sri Sita Ramachandra, Shri 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 Sita Ramachandra. Bhadram Karnibhihi Sriniyama Devaha, Bhadram Pasyema Akshabirya Jatraha, Stiraya Rangaishtu Shivamsas Tanuvir, Vishema Devahitam Yadayahu. May we see with these eyes what is good and spiritual. May we hear with these ears what is noble and uplifting. And may we, while worshipping the Lord and Mother with healthy minds and bodies, live a life which is beneficial to us and to all others. Jai Sri Rama, Jai Sri Krishna, Jai Sri Ramakrishna. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om peace, peace, peace. Peace be unto us, peace be unto all. Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat.